A millionaire cowboy fleeing murder charges finds a rejected mail-order bride freezing at a desolate rail station, offering her work that becomes the foundation of an unexpected partnership. When lawmen arrive to drag him back to face his past, will she stand by the man who saw her true worth when no one else would? Snow fell like tiny daggers across the empty train platform, each flake cutting through the bitter December air of 1867. The wooden bench creaked under Violet Ashford's weight as she pulled her thin coat tighter, watching her breath form white clouds that disappeared into the gray Wyoming Territory morning. The train's black smoke had long since faded into the distance, taking with it her last hope of escape. In her trembling hands, she clutched a crumpled telegram that had shattered her world in just 7 words. Changed my mind. Do not come. Sorry. 3 months of letters. 3 months of planning. 3 months of believing that William Garrett wanted to marry her, only to be cast aside like yesterday's newspaper the moment she arrived in Cheyenne. Her stomach growled, reminding her that breakfast had been a luxury she couldn't afford. The $17 in her purse wouldn't last long in this frontier town where everything cost twice what it did back in Philadelphia. She had no family to wire for help, no friends to take her in, no skills that seemed valuable in this harsh land of cowboys and cattle. Other passengers hurried past her bench, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. A woman in expensive furs whispered to her companion, pointing at Violet with barely hidden disgust. Everyone could tell what she was, a mail-order bride who'd been rejected before she even met her intended husband. The shame burned hotter than the cold wind. How had she fallen so low? 6 months ago, she'd been teaching at Miss Porter's school for young ladies, respected and independent. Then the headmistress discovered her father's gambling debts and the scandal that followed. No respectable family would hire a teacher whose father had stolen from the church collection plate. So she'd answered William Garrett's advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper, desperate enough to marry a stranger for security. His letters had seemed kind, promising a simple life on a cattle ranch where her past wouldn't matter. She'd sold everything she owned to buy the train ticket west, believing she could start fresh in Wyoming Territory. Now she sat abandoned on a train platform, watching the sun climb higher while her hopes sank lower. The depot agent kept glancing at her through the window, probably wondering when she'd move along. But where could she go? The boarding house had no vacant rooms. The few respectable jobs for women were already filled. She could see the saloon girls across the street, painted and laughing as they swept snow from their doorway. Was that her only choice? To sell her dignity along with everything else? A group of cowboys rode past, their horses' hooves splashing slush onto the platform. One of them tipped his hat mockingly in her direction, saying something that made his friends laugh. Heat flooded her cheeks as she realized they all knew her story. In a town this small, news traveled faster than the morning wind. The church bell chimed 10 o'clock. She'd been sitting here for 3 hours, watching the world move around her while she remained frozen in place. Her fingers were numb despite her gloves, and her feet felt like blocks of ice inside her thin city boots. Maybe she should spend her last dollars on a return ticket to Philadelphia. At least there she could find work as a seamstress or factory girl. The wages would be terrible and the hours long, but it had to be better than this. She stood slowly, her legs stiff from cold and fear. "Ma'am, that train's been gone near an hour." The voice startled her so badly she almost dropped her bag. She spun around to see a tall man in a wool coat, his green eyes studying her with unexpected kindness. He looked to be in his 30s, with sun-darkened skin and gentle lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who smiled often. "I'm quite aware of that, thank you." She tried to keep her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. He stepped closer, moving with the easy confidence of someone used to wide-open spaces. His clothes were well-made but practical leather boots, wool pants, a coat that had seen honest work but still looked expensive. A silver watch chain caught the pale sunlight. "James Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I own the Triple Crown Ranch about 10 miles outside town." She studied his face, searching for the cruel amusement she'd seen in other men's eyes today. Instead, she found only genuine concern and something else, recognition, as if he understood exactly what she was feeling. You wouldn't happen to be Miss Violet Ashford, would you? Her blood turned to ice water. He knew her name. He knew who she was and why she was here, sitting alone on this platform like some piece of unwanted baggage. The humiliation crashed over her in waves. How do you know that? She gripped her bag tighter. Ready to run though, she had nowhere to go. James Whitmore's expression darkened. Bill Garrett's been my neighbor for 15 years. Drinks too much, thinks too little, and treats people like they don't matter. He paused, his jaw tight with anger. What he did to you was wrong, Miss Ashford. Plain and simple wrong. The kindness in his voice nearly broke through the walls she'd built around her heart. No one had defended her in months. Not when her father's crimes came to light. Not when she lost her teaching position. Not when she'd been forced to answer matrimonial advertisements like some desperate spinster. I have arrangements, she lied, lifting her chin despite the tremor in her voice. Thank you for your concern, but I can manage quite well on my own. James glanced at her single carpet bag, then at the empty platform around them. His green eyes held too much understanding. The boarding house is full up. Has been for weeks since the railroad brought in all those new workers. Her heart sank further. She'd planned to secure a room there while deciding what to do next. Then I'll find somewhere else. Miss Ashford, I have a business proposition for you. The words hung in the cold air between them. Violet had heard about business propositions from strange men, and none of them led anywhere respectable. She took a step backward. I need a teacher, James said quickly, seeming to read her thoughts. My ranch hands have children, 8 of them, ages 6 to 14. They need someone who can teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic. Someone educated. A teacher. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the one thing she knew how to do well, the one skill that had given her pride and purpose before everything fell apart. The parents would pay $20 a month, plus room and board in my ranch house. It's honest work, Miss Ashford. Respectable work. $20 was more than she'd made at Miss Porter's school. Room and board meant safety, shelter, meals she wouldn't have to worry about affording. But why would a stranger offer such kindness to someone like her? Why? The question came out sharper than she intended. Why would you help someone you don't even know? James was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the mountains that rose like purple giants beyond the town. When he looked back at her, something painful flickered behind his eyes. Because I know what it feels like to be judged unfairly. To have people make up their minds about who you are before they know the first thing about your character. There was a story there, hidden beneath his calm exterior. What had happened to James Whitmore that made him understand rejection so well? The children, she said carefully. Where would they come from? Neighboring ranches mostly. Some of the hands live on my property with their families. Others ride over daily. Their parents want them educated, but Cheyenne's too far for regular travel. He pulled out his pocket watch, solid silver with intricate engravings that looked expensive. School would run Monday through Friday, 8 to 3. Evenings and weekends would be your own time. Her own time. When was the last time she'd had that luxury? At Miss Porter's, she'd been on duty from dawn until the girls went to bed, responsible for their education, their behavior, their moral development. This sounded almost too good to be true. I'm not running a charity, Miss Ashford, James added, as if reading her hesitation. You'd earn every penny. These children need someone who understands discipline and learning, someone who won't give up on them when the work gets hard. And you think I'm that person? I think you're someone who's faced hard times and kept going. That's exactly what children need to see. That setbacks don't have to be endings. The wind picked up, swirling snow around their feet and cutting through her thin coat like a knife. She had to make a decision soon, before the cold made the choice for her. The living arrangements, she said slowly. Where exactly would I stay? Ranch house has a separate wing for guests. You'd have your own room, private entrance, use of the kitchen when needed. Mrs. Caldwell, my housekeeper, maintains the household. She's particular about propriety. A chaperone, then, that eased some of her concerns about the situation's respectability. Mr. Whitmore, I have to ask, What's in this for you? Most ranch owners wouldn't care whether their workers' children can read. His smile held sadness she didn't understand. Let's just say I believe education can change a person's whole life. Give them choices they wouldn't have otherwise. And if I prove unsatisfactory as a teacher, then we'll part ways with no hard feelings and a good reference for your next position. He extended his gloved hand. Do we have an agreement, Miss Ashford? She looked at his outstretched hand, then at the empty platform, the distant mountains, the uncertain future stretching ahead of her. William Garrett had thrown away her planned life like it meant nothing. Now this stranger was offering her a chance to build something new. Yes, Mr. Whitmore, we have an agreement. His handshake was firm and warm, sealing a bargain that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. The sleigh runners cut through fresh snow with a sound like whispered secrets as they left Cheyenne behind. Violet clutched the leather seat, her knuckles white beneath her thin gloves, watching James Whitmore guide the two horses with practiced ease through the winding trail. Mountains rose around them like sleeping giants, their peaks sharp against the gray sky. Pine trees heavy with snow lined the path, creating a tunnel of white and green that seemed to lead into another world entirely. The only sounds were the jingle of harness bells, the crunch of snow beneath the runners, and her own rapid heartbeat. How long have you owned the ranch? She asked, trying to break the silence that had stretched between them since leaving town. 4 years come spring. James kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but she caught something guarded in his voice. Bought it from a family heading back east. They said the winters were too harsh, the work too demanding. But you stayed. I found what I was looking for here. He glanced at her briefly. Sometimes a man needs to get far from civilization to remember who he really is. What had he been running from? The question burned on her tongue, but she swallowed it down. They were both strangers carrying secrets, after all. The trail curved around a stand of aspens, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. Ahead, a wooden gate appeared, solid and well-built, with Triple Crown Ranch carved into a sign that swayed gently in the wind. James pulled up the horses to open the gate, and Violet got her first glimpse of her new home. The ranch spread across a wide valley, buildings scattered like children's toys against the white landscape. The main house stood 2 stories tall, built from logs and stone, with smoke curling from multiple chimneys. Barns and corrals stretched in neat lines, and even buried under snow, she could see the organized prosperity of a successful operation. It's larger than I expected, she admitted. 3,000 head of cattle plus horses and sheep. Takes a lot of buildings to keep everything running. Pride colored his voice as they approached the house. Most of the hands live in the bunkhouse, but families get their own cabins. You'll meet some of the children tomorrow. As they pulled up to the main house, a figure emerged from the front door. A woman in her 40s, tall and stern-faced, with steel-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features. She wore a dark dress and an expression that could freeze water. Mrs. Helena Caldwell, James said quietly. My housekeeper. She's been here since the beginning. Keeps everything running smooth as clockwork. Helena approached the sleigh, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Violet's appearance. The travel-worn dress, the city-style boots, the obvious marks of recent distress. Her gaze lingered on Violet's carpetbag with something that might have been disdain. So this is our new teacher, Helena said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone used to being obeyed. Another charity case, James? Heat flooded Violet's cheeks. I'm here to work, Mrs. Caldwell, not to be rescued. Something shifted in Helena's expression, perhaps approval, or recognition of backbone where she'd expected weakness. We'll see about that. Teaching frontier children isn't the same as instructing pampered city girls. I wouldn't expect it to be. James helped Violet down from the sleigh, his hands steady at her waist. Helena, Miss Ashford will be staying in the East Wing. Please see that she has everything she needs. Of course. Helena's tone suggested this was one more burden in an already difficult day. Suppers at 6. We keep ranch hours here, early to bed, early to rise. The house's interior took Violet's breath away. Rich wood paneling lined the walls, polished to a warm glow. Native rugs covered gleaming floors, and a massive stone fireplace dominated the main room. Everything spoke of money spent wisely, comfortable but not ostentatious, practical but beautiful. "The children's schoolroom is through here," James said, leading her down a hallway lined with landscape paintings. "I had it set up based on what the parents told me they wanted their young ones to learn." The room that would become her classroom was larger than she dared hope. Tall windows faced east to catch the morning light, and 8 small desks sat in neat rows facing a larger teacher's desk. A blackboard covered one wall, and shelves lined another, waiting to be filled with books and supplies. "It's perfect," she breathed. "The children start arriving at 8 tomorrow morning. Some ride over from neighboring ranches, others walk from the family cabins." James paused at the door. "I should warn you, they're not used to formal schooling. Most have learned what they know from their mothers or older siblings." "What ages did you say?" 6 to 14. Maria Gonzalez is the youngest. Her father runs our sheep operation. Tommy O'Brien is the oldest. His pa works the cattle. Mix of backgrounds, languages, experiences. He met her eyes directly. "Think you can handle that variety?" "I've taught mixed classes before. Children are children, regardless of where they come from. These aren't city children, Miss Ashford. They've grown up with different expectations, different needs. Then I'll learn to meet them where they are." Determination strengthened her voice. "That's what good teaching requires." James studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the right. Helena will show you around the rest of the house. We eat together, ranch hands, family, everyone. No separation between employer and employee at my table." After he left, Violet stood alone in her new classroom, running her fingers along the smooth desktop. For the first time in months, she felt something like hope stirring in her chest. This was work she understood, purpose she could embrace. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that James Whitmore was more complicated than he appeared. His clothes were expensive, his speech educated, his manner refined despite the frontier setting. What kind of man built such prosperity in the wilderness? And why did she sense secrets lurking behind his green eyes? Her room proved simple but comfortable, a bed with clean linens, a washstand, a desk by the window, and a wardrobe for her few possessions. Through the glass, she could see the ranch buildings spread below, lamplight beginning to flicker in windows as evening approached. Tomorrow she would meet the children, begin the work that might rebuild her sense of worth. Tonight, she would try to forget William Garrett's rejection and focus on the unexpected opportunity James Whitmore had given her. But first, she had to survive supper with Helena Caldwell, who clearly viewed her as an unwelcome intruder in her well-ordered domain. The dining room buzzed with voices and the clink of silverware as ranch hands filed in for supper, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their clothes carrying the honest smell of hard work. Violet hesitated in the doorway, suddenly uncertain about her place in this rough-edged gathering. "Miss Ashford," a cheerful voice called from across the room. A young woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands waved her over. "I'm Mary O'Brien. My Tommy will be in your class starting tomorrow." Relief flooded through Violet as Mary pulled out a chair beside her. The other ranch hands nodded politely as James made introductions. Carlos Gonzalez, the sheep foreman whose daughter Maria would be her youngest student. Big Jim Fletcher, whose twin boys were reportedly handful enough for any teacher. Old Pete Sullivan, whose granddaughter lived with him since her parents died of fever. "How many children will you have total?" Violet asked Mary as platters of beef, potatoes, and vegetables made their way around the long table. 8 regular. Maybe 10 when weather permits kids from farther out to ride over. Mary's Irish accent colored her words. Ages all mixed up, skill levels too. Some can barely write their names, others read better than their parents. That's quite a range. Tommy's the oldest at 14, smart as a whip but stubborn as a mule. Been helping his father with ranch work since he was 8. Thinks book learning is a waste of time. Mary's smile held maternal pride mixed with exasperation. Might take some convincing to get him focused on studies. From the head of the table, James's voice carried over the dinner conversation. Miss Ashford comes from Philadelphia, taught at a fancy girls' school before coming west. What brought you out here? Asked Carlos, his weathered face curious. Most educated ladies stay where life's easier. Heat crept up Violet's neck. How much should she reveal about her circumstances? I wanted a change of scenery. Well, you'll get plenty of that, laughed Big Jim. My boys Jake and Luke will test your patience something fierce. They've been running wild since their ma died 2 winters ago. The casual mention of death reminded Violet how harsh frontier life could be. These people faced challenges she'd never imagined in her sheltered city existence. Disease, accidents, brutal weather, isolation from medical help. Tell me about the other children, she said, genuinely curious. Little Maria speaks Spanish at home, English here. Sweet as pie but shy around strangers. Carlos's eyes crinkled with affection. Her mama wants her to learn proper writing, so maybe she can be a teacher herself someday. Peter Schmidt's 12, sharp with numbers but struggles with reading. His family came from Germany 3 years back. Mary passed the bread basket. And there's Annie Sullivan, old Pete's granddaughter. 10 years old, lost her voice after her parents died. Hasn't spoken a word since, but she understands everything. Violet's heart clenched. A child traumatized into silence would need special care, gentle patience. What approaches have been tried with Annie? Nothing much, admitted Pete, his grizzled face sad. Doc in town said she might talk again when she's ready, might not. We just love her and wait. Sometimes children communicate in ways other than speech. Drawing, writing, even gestures can be starting points. You've dealt with such things before? James asked from across the table. Every child faces difficulties. Good teachers learn to recognize different kinds of intelligence, different ways of learning. Violet felt more confident discussing education than her personal circumstances. The key is meeting each child where they are, not where you think they should be. Sounds like fancy city talk, muttered a voice from the far end of the table. Violet looked to see a thin man with hard eyes watching her skeptically. Kids out here need practical skills, not book learning that won't help them survive. Education provides tools for survival too, Violet replied evenly. Reading helps people understand contracts. Writing lets them communicate with distant family. Arithmetic prevents them from being cheated in business dealings. Frank's right though, said another hand. What good's poetry and history when a blizzard's coming? Maybe our children deserve choices their parents didn't have, Mary said firmly. Maybe they could become doctors or lawyers or teachers themselves if they get proper schooling. The debate continued good-naturedly around the table, but Violet sensed the real question underneath. Would she prove herself valuable to this community, or would she be another outsider who couldn't adapt to frontier realities? Helena cleared the main course with crisp efficiency, replacing it with apple pie that smelled like heaven. As conversation shifted to ranch business, cattle prices, weather predictions, spring plans, Violet found herself studying James more closely. He listened carefully to his workers' opinions, asked thoughtful questions, made decisions with quiet authority. But there was something almost refined about his manner. His table manners were perfect, his vocabulary educated, his way of speaking more polished than most wealthy men she'd known back east. Who was James Whitmore, really? And what had brought a man of obvious breeding and means to this remote Wyoming valley? Miss Ashford. Mary's voice broke into her thoughts. I was asking if you'd like me to walk you to the schoolroom early tomorrow. Help you get organized before the children arrive? That's very kind, thank you. Violet smiled gratefully. I want to make a good first impression. Just be yourself, advised Carlos. Kids can spot a fake from a mile away. Be honest, be fair, and they'll respect you even if they don't always like your lessons. As the evening wound down and ranch hands dispersed to their quarters, James approached her chair. How are you feeling about tomorrow? Nervous, excited, hopeful. She stood, smoothing her skirts. It's been months since I've had a real purpose. What happened to your last teaching position? The question was gentle but direct. Violet hesitated. How much truth could she afford to share? There was a scandal, not of my making, but it affected my reputation. I'm sorry, that must have been difficult. It was. She met his eyes, seeing genuine sympathy there. Sometimes life doesn't go according to plan. No, it doesn't. Something flickered across his features, understanding born from personal experience. But sometimes the detours lead to better destinations than we originally planned. Was he speaking from experience? What detour had brought James Whitmore to this remote ranch? Good night, Miss Ashford. Sleep well. Good night, Mr. Whitmore. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Violet felt the weight of tomorrow's expectations settling on her shoulders. 8 children with different backgrounds, abilities, and needs. Parents who questioned the value of formal education. A community that would judge her worth based on results, not intentions. But for the first time in months, the challenge energized rather than terrified her. She had work that mattered, a chance to prove herself valuable, an opportunity to shape young minds and futures. Tomorrow would bring her first real test as the new teacher of Triple Crown Ranch. She intended to pass it. 8 pairs of curious eyes stared at Violet from behind the small wooden desks as morning sunlight streamed through the schoolroom windows. She stood before them in her best dress, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the piece of chalk that would write her first lesson on the blackboard. Good morning, children. My name is Miss Ashford, and I'm very pleased to meet all of you. The responses varied wildly. Little Maria Gonzalez smiled shyly from the front row, her dark braids tied with bright ribbons. Tommy O'Brien slouched in the back corner, his 14-year-old frame too large for the desk, arms crossed in obvious resistance. The Schmidt twins, Jake and Luke Fletcher, whispered and giggled until their older brother Peter shot them a warning look. Most heartbreaking was Annie Sullivan, who sat perfectly still in the middle row, her large blue eyes watching everything but her mouth remaining firmly closed. The 10-year-old hadn't spoken since her parents died, and Violet wondered if today might begin to change that. Let's start by learning about each other, Violet said, moving away from the formal teacher's desk to sit on its edge. I'd like each of you to tell me your name, your age, and one thing you enjoy doing. Why should we care what you want to know? Tommy's voice carried the challenging tone of a boy trying to sound like a man. Book learning won't help me rope cattle or mend fences. Several children shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Violet kept her expression calm, though her heart raced. This was her first real test, and everyone in the room knew it. You're absolutely right, Tommy. Book learning won't teach you to rope cattle. She stood and walked toward his desk. But it might help you understand why cattle prices change, or how to calculate how much feed you'll need for winter, or how to write letters to buyers in distant cities. My pa handles all that business stuff. And what happens when your pa gets old, or sick, or when you want to start your own ranch someday? Violet kept her voice gentle but firm. Knowledge gives you choices, Tommy. It doesn't replace practical skills, it adds to them. The boy's defiant expression wavered slightly. Around the room, other children watched the exchange with fascination. This was clearly not the first time Tommy had challenged authority. Now then, Violet continued, returning to her position at the front. Who would like to share first? Little Maria raised her hand tentatively. My name is Maria Gonzalez. I am 6 years old. I like to help my mama cook tortillas. Thank you, Maria. Can you tell me what ingredients go into tortillas? Flour and water and salt and, Maria's face scrunched in concentration. Lard, supplied Peter Schmidt helpfully. My mama makes them too. Excellent. So you already know about measuring ingredients, which is mathematics, and following a recipe, which is reading. You're learning every day without even realizing it. The children exchanged glances, beginning to see connections they'd never noticed before. Even Tommy looked slightly interested despite himself. One by one, the children shared their introductions. Peter loved working with numbers, helping his father calculate lumber costs for building projects. The Fletcher twins enjoyed exploring the mountains, which led to a discussion about geography and weather patterns. 10-year-old Sarah Chun, whose father ran the general store, practiced writing by copying inventory lists. When they reached Annie Sullivan, the room grew quiet. The little girl looked down at her desk, her shoulders tense with anxiety. "Annie doesn't talk," whispered Jake Fletcher. "That's all right," Violet said gently. "There are many ways to communicate besides speaking." She picked up a piece of paper and walked to Annie's desk. "Would you like to draw me a picture of something you enjoy?" Annie looked up with surprise, then slowly nodded. Violet placed the paper before her and offered a pencil. The little girl began to sketch with careful, precise strokes. While Annie drew, Violet continued the introductions with the remaining children. When Annie finished, she held up her paper shyly. The drawing showed a beautiful horse, detailed and lifelike despite the simple medium. "This is wonderful, Annie. You're quite an artist." Violet studied the picture carefully. "Is this your horse?" Annie shook her head and pointed toward the window. Following her gaze, Violet saw a magnificent black stallion in the nearest corral, its coat gleaming in the morning sun. "Ah, that's Thunder," said Tommy, his sullen demeanor softening. "Mr. Whitmore's prize horse. Annie loves that animal, spends hours watching him. Perhaps Annie could teach us about horses," Violet suggested. "She obviously pays close attention to details." For the first time, Annie's face lit up with something approaching a smile. The morning progressed with basic assessments. Violet discovered that skill levels varied dramatically. Maria could barely write her name, while Tommy read better than some adults she'd known. Peter excelled at arithmetic but struggled with spelling. The Fletcher twins had boundless energy but short attention spans. Most surprising was the discovery that several children spoke multiple languages. Maria was fluent in Spanish and English, Peter knew German phrases from his family, and Sarah understood some Chinese from her grandparents. "This gives us wonderful opportunities," Violet explained during their mid-morning break. "You can teach each other words from different languages, learn about different cultures." "My pa says speaking foreign languages is un-American," muttered one of the Fletcher twins. "Your pa's wrong," Tommy said firmly, surprising everyone. "Carlos taught me enough Spanish to talk to the Mexican vaqueros. Makes working cattle a lot easier when you can understand each other." Violet smiled at this unexpected support from her most resistant student. Perhaps she was making progress after all. The afternoon brought practical lessons. Using ranch examples, she taught basic arithmetic, calculating feed costs, measuring distances between pastures, figuring out how many cattle could graze in specific areas. For reading, she shared stories about frontier adventures that held even Tommy's attention. But the real breakthrough came during the final hour, when she introduced creative writing. "I want each of you to write about your most exciting day on the ranch," she instructed. "Use details that help readers see and feel what you experienced." As the children bent over their papers, Violet noticed Annie watching them work with obvious longing. She approached the girl's desk quietly. "Would you like to draw your exciting day instead of writing it?" she whispered. Annie nodded eagerly and began sketching with renewed enthusiasm. Her pictures told a wordless story of helping birth a foal, her drawings capturing the wonder and joy of that spring morning with remarkable skill. When the school day ended at 3 o'clock, the children filed out chattering excitedly about tomorrow's lessons. Even Tommy paused at the door. "Miss Ashford? That thing about writing to cattle buyers. Could you really teach us how to do that?" "Absolutely. Business correspondence is an important skill for anyone planning to run their own operation." He nodded seriously. Maybe this school thing isn't completely useless after all. As the last child disappeared down the path toward home, Violet sank into her chair with exhaustion and exhilaration. The day had been challenging but successful. She'd found ways to connect with each child, even silent Annie. But her satisfaction was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through the window, she saw a rider approaching fast, dust trailing behind his horse. Something about his urgent pace sent worry crawling up her spine. Who was coming to the ranch in such desperate haste? And what news would they bring to shatter this perfect first day? The rider burst into the ranch yard like a man fleeing demons, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cool December air. Violet watched from her classroom window as James emerged from the barn, his face grim as he recognized the approaching figure. "Bill Garrett?" she whispered, her blood turning to ice water. The man who had rejected her without meeting her, who had left her stranded and humiliated at the train station, now sat his horse in James Whitmore's yard. Even from a distance, she could see the cruel set of his mouth, the arrogant tilt of his head that spoke of a man who took pleasure in others' misfortune. Violet's first instinct was to hide, to avoid another confrontation with the source of her shame. But something in James's posture, the protective way he positioned himself between Garrett and the house, made her stay at the window. "Whitmore," Garrett's voice carried across the yard, slurred with drink despite the early hour. "Heard you took in my reject." Always were soft-hearted about strays. Heat flooded Violet's cheeks. His reject. The words hit like physical blows, reducing her to nothing more than unwanted property. James stepped closer to Garrett's horse, his voice too low for Violet to hear, but his meaning clear from his rigid stance. Whatever he said made Garrett laugh, an ugly sound that raised the hair on her arms. "Don't get all protective, rich boy. I'm not here to take her back. Wouldn't have her now if she begged." Garrett's words carried clearly in the cold air. "Just came to see what kind of fool would clean up my mess. Get off my land, Bill." James's voice rang with authority that brooked no argument. "Not until I say my piece." Garrett dismounted unsteadily, the smell of whiskey reaching even Violet's distant position. "You think you're better than the rest of US, don't you? With your fancy house and your educated ways." Other ranch hands began emerging from various buildings, drawn by the commotion. Violet spotted Carlos, Big Jim, and several others forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Their faces showed the same protective instinct she'd seen in James. "But I know things about you, Whitmore. Things that might interest your new teacher." Garrett's smile turned vicious. "Wonder if she knows what kind of man she's really working for?" Violet's heart stuttered. What was Garrett talking about? What secrets was he threatening to reveal? "You're drunk, Bill. Go home before you say something you'll regret." "Oh, I won't regret it. Been waiting years to watch you squirm." Garrett pulled a folded newspaper from his coat pocket. "Got this from a passenger on yesterday's train. 3-month-old paper from Boston. Very interesting reading." Boston. Violet pressed closer to the window, straining to hear every word. Why would news from Boston matter to James? "See, there's a story here about a missing heir. James Whitmore III, son of the shipping fortune family. Disappeared 4 years ago after some scandal involving a dead business partner." Garrett's voice dripped with malicious satisfaction. "Reward of $5,000 for information leading to his whereabouts." The world tilted sideways. James Whitmore III, shipping fortune, dead business partner. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The expensive clothes, the educated speech, the way he carried himself with unconscious authority. James wasn't just a successful rancher. He was wealthy Boston aristocracy, hiding in the Wyoming wilderness from something terrible enough to make him abandon his entire life. "What happened, rich boy? Business deal go wrong?" Partner asked too many questions about missing money. Garrett's accusations grew bolder as he sensed weakness. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Story says Thomas Hartwell died after a business dispute with his partner. Says James Whitmore disappeared before the investigation concluded. Garrett waved the newspaper like a weapon. "That's you, isn't it? The missing murderer." Murderer. The word hung in the air like a curse. Violet gripped the windowsill until her knuckles went white, her mind reeling. The kind man who had rescued her from the train station, who had offered her work and dignity, who treated his employees like family. Was he really a killer? "I didn't murder anyone," James said quietly. But even from her distance, Violet could hear the pain in his voice. "Maybe not on purpose, but a man's still dead, and you ran instead of facing the consequences. That makes you a coward and a criminal in my book." The ranch hands shifted restlessly, hands moving toward guns that most frontier men carried. The tension ratcheted higher with each word. Violence crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. "Bill, you need to leave. Now." James's voice carried deadly warning. "Oh, I'll leave. But first, I think I'll have a chat with your pretty teacher. Tell her exactly what kind of man she's working for." Garrett started toward the house with unsteady steps. That broke James's restraint. He moved faster than Violet thought possible, intercepting Garrett before he'd taken 3 steps. The 2 men faced each other, fury radiating from both figures. "You stay away from her. Protective of your new pet, are you? Wonder if she'll be so grateful when she learns the truth." Garrett's leer made Violet's skin crawl. Maybe she'll decide she needs a real man instead of a lying coward. The punch came so fast Violet barely saw it. One moment Garrett was standing, the next he was sprawled in the dirt, blood streaming from his nose. James stood over him, fists clenched, chest heaving with controlled rage. "I said get off my land." Garrett struggled to his feet, touching his bloody nose gingerly. "You'll regret that, Whitmore. Before I'm done, everyone in the territory will know what you really are." He remounted his horse with difficulty, swaying dangerously in the saddle. "Enjoy your respectable life while it lasts. Won't be long before the law comes calling." As Garrett rode away, his threats echoing across the valley, Violet sank into her desk chair with trembling legs. Everything she thought she knew about James Whitmore had just crumbled into dust. He was a fugitive from justice, a man accused of murder who had built his new life on lies and hidden identity. The generous employer who had saved her from disgrace was himself running from shame so great he'd abandoned everything familiar. But was he guilty? The man she'd come to respect and trust, could he really be a killer? Through the window, she watched James stand alone in the yard, his shoulders bowed with the weight of his exposed secrets. The ranch hands had dispersed, but she could see them watching from doorways and windows, their faces troubled. How long before word spread beyond the ranch? How long before lawmen came looking for James Whitmore III? And when they did, what would happen to her position, her new life, her chance at rebuilding her worth? Most frightening of all, what would happen to the man who had shown her kindness when she needed it most? A soft knock at the classroom door made her jump. James stood in the doorway, his face pale but resolved, blood on his knuckles from the punch he'd thrown. "Miss Ashford," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." The confession came in broken pieces as they sat by the dying fire in James's study, the weight of his secrets finally demanding release. Violet watched shadows dance across his face while he spoke of a life that seemed as distant as a fairy tale, Boston mansions, shipping empires, and a world of privilege she could barely imagine. "My real name is James Whitmore III. My family owned half the waterfront in Boston Harbor." His voice carried the hollow tone of a man revisiting his worst memories. "I was engaged to Caroline Pemberton, beautiful, wealthy, everything my parents wanted in a daughter-in-law." Violet remained silent, sensing the pain beneath his careful words. Through the window, snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in deceptive peace. 3 days before our wedding, I discovered she'd been meeting secretly with my business partner, Thomas Hartwell. Not just meeting planning. They intended to use my family's money to fund their own shipping ventures after we married. James's hands clenched in his lap. I was to be the unwitting financier of my own betrayal. "What did you do?" I confronted Thomas at his office that night, demanded the truth about their scheme. James stared into the fire, seeing events from 4 years past. He laughed at me, called me a naive fool who deserved to be cheated. Said Caroline could never love someone as weak as me. The bitterness in his voice made Violet's heart ache. She understood the pain of discovering that someone you trusted viewed you as worthless. We fought. I'd never been in a real fight before. Gentlemen's boxing at Harvard was nothing like Thomas's street brawling. James touched his jaw unconsciously, as if feeling old bruises. He grabbed a poker from the fireplace, swung it at my head. I ducked, tackled him, and we both went down hard. The fall killed him? Not immediately. He struck his head on the corner of his marble desk. Lived for 3 days in the hospital, conscious enough to tell everyone I'd attacked him without provocation. James's laugh held no humor. Caroline backed his story completely, claimed I'd threatened both of them when I discovered their affair. Violet tried to imagine gentle James as a murderer and failed. Everything about him spoke of controlled strength used for protection, not violence. Why didn't you stay and fight the charges? Surely people knew your character. Thomas's family had political connections, newspaper influence. The story became about a jealous fiancé who couldn't accept rejection, who turned violent when his bride chose another man. James pulled out his silver pocket watch, opening it to reveal not a timepiece but a small photograph. The papers painted me as spoiled and dangerous. My own family began to doubt me when the evidence mounted. The photograph showed a beautiful woman with cold eyes and perfect features, Caroline Pemberton, the source of James's exile. So you ran. I liquidated what assets I could access quietly, bought passage west under a false name. Figured I'd disappear into the wilderness where Boston's influence couldn't reach. He snapped the watch closed. Found this valley, bought the ranch from a family heading back to civilization. Thought I could build something clean here, something honest. And you have built something honest. Violet leaned forward, her voice firm with conviction. This ranch, the way you treat your workers, the respect you've earned, that's real, James. That matters. Does it? When it's all based on lies. Before Violet could answer, the sound of approaching horses shattered the evening quiet. Multiple riders, moving fast, their hoofbeats drumming against the frozen ground like an advancing army. James was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with fluid grace. 6 men, armed, riding like they have official business. Violet joined him at the window, her stomach dropping as she saw the glint of badges in the lamplight. Lawmen, sheriff's deputies, by the look of them. James's voice remained calm, but she could see tension coiling in his shoulders. Bill Garrett works fast when he's motivated. The riders pulled up in the ranch yard, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold. The lead man dismounted with authority, his badge catching the light from the house windows. James Whitmore, his voice carried across the yard. Sheriff Tom Morrison, Laramie County. Need to speak with you. This was it. The moment James's carefully built new life came crashing down. Violet felt panic rising in her throat as she watched him straighten his shoulders, preparing to face whatever consequences awaited. What happens now? She whispered. Now I pay for 4 years of running. James moved toward the door, his steps measured and deliberate. Miss Ashford, whatever happens next, I want you to know. Giving you a chance to teach those children was the best decision I've made since coming west. James, wait dash. But he was already gone, walking out to meet his fate with the quiet dignity of a man who'd finally stopped running from his past. Violet pressed against the window, watching as James approached the sheriff. The conversation was too distant to hear, but she could read the tension in every gesture, every stance. Then Sheriff Morrison said something that made James's head jerk up in surprise. The sheriff consulted a folded paper, speaking again with what looked like reluctance rather than accusation. What was happening? This didn't look like an arrest. The sheriff's body language suggested he was delivering news rather than taking a prisoner. Helena appeared beside her at the window, the housekeeper's face tight with worry. That's not how lawmen look when they're here to arrest someone, she observed. What do you mean? 20 years on the frontier teaches you to read men's intentions. Those deputies aren't surrounding him, aren't drawing weapons. They're explaining something. As if to confirm Helena's words, Sheriff Morrison handed James a document, pointing to specific sections as he spoke. James read it slowly, his expression shifting from resignation to confusion to something that might have been hope. What could they be telling him? Violet wondered aloud. Only one way to find out. Helena headed for the door. Come on. Whatever news they brought, James will need friends nearby. They hurried outside, joining the circle of ranch hands who had gathered at a respectful distance. The sheriff noticed their approach and nodded politely. Ladies, gentlemen, I was just explaining to Mr. Whitmore here that there's been developments in his case back east. James looked up from the document. His face pale but his eyes bright with an emotion Violet couldn't identify. Caroline Pemberton came forward last month. She recanted her testimony. The words hit like lightning. Violet felt her knees go weak with relief and confusion. Seems the lady's conscience finally got the better of her, Sheriff Morrison continued. She admitted to lying about the circumstances of Thomas Hartwell's death. Claims it was self-defense that Hartwell attacked first. Why would she change her story now? James's voice held wonder and suspicion in equal measure. Guilt, maybe. Or maybe Hartwell's death wasn't the only secret she was keeping. The sheriff's expression suggested he knew more than he was saying. Point is, the charges against you have been dropped. Boston police want to close the case officially, but they need your testimony to make it complete. Freedom. After 4 years of exile, James was free to reclaim his name, his life, his place in the world he'd fled. But as Violet watched his face, she saw conflict rather than joy. The man who had built a new identity in the Wyoming wilderness now faced an impossible choice: return to the wealth and status he'd abandoned, or stay in the harsh but honest life he'd created. How long do I have to decide? James asked quietly. We'll be in Cheyenne for 3 days. You can send word if you want to return east and clear your name officially. Sheriff Morrison remounted his horse. For what it's worth, you've built something impressive here. Seems a shame to abandon it. As the lawman rode away, an uncomfortable silence settled over the ranch yard. Everyone understood the magnitude of what had just happened. Their respected employer, the man who had given them work and purpose, might soon leave for a life of privilege they could never share. So you'll be going back to Boston, Helena said, her voice carefully neutral. James looked around the ranch at the buildings he'd constructed, the people he'd come to care for, the life he'd built with his own hands. I don't know. But Violet heard the longing in his voice, saw the way his gaze turned eastward toward the railroad tracks that could carry him home to respectability and wealth. Why wouldn't he want to reclaim everything he'd lost? And when he did, what would happen to the teacher who had briefly shared his exile? Dawn came gray and cold as Violet stood at her bedroom window, watching James saddle his black stallion in the yard below. He moved with purpose but without joy, like a man preparing for surgery rather than celebration. The news of his freedom should have brought happiness, yet the ranch felt heavy with unspoken sorrow. She'd barely slept, her mind spinning with questions that had no easy answers. Would he return to Boston and reclaim his birthright? Would the children lose their teacher when her position became unnecessary? Most painfully, would she lose the first man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself? A soft knock interrupted her brooding. Miss Ashford. Mary O'Brien's voice carried worry. The children are asking about school today. Should we tell them to come as usual? Violet turned from the window, seeing the concern etched on Mary's kind face. Word of last night's revelation had spread through the ranch like wildfire. Everyone knew their world might be about to change dramatically. Of course they should come. Learning doesn't stop because adults have decisions to make. Violet reached for her shawl, wrapping it around her shoulders like armor. The children need routine, especially when everything else feels uncertain. In the schoolroom, 8 young faces reflected the confusion their parents felt. Even 6-year-old Maria seemed to sense that something important was happening, while 14-year-old Tommy wore the defensive expression of someone expecting disappointment. Is it true Mr. Whitmore's really a rich man from back east? Sarah Chun asked, her dark eyes wide with curiosity. Will he leave us? Added Peter Schmidt, voicing the fear they all shared. Violet chose her words carefully. Mr. Whitmore has been given a choice about his future. Whatever he decides, we'll continue our studies and support each other. But if he goes, what happens to the school? Tommy's question cut to the heart of everyone's worry. I don't know, Violet admitted. But I do know that education is valuable wherever it happens. Even if things change, the knowledge you gain belongs to you forever. She threw herself into teaching with fierce determination, leading the children through arithmetic problems that used ranch examples, calculating cattle feed, measuring pasture distances, figuring breeding ratios. For reading, she shared stories of frontier adventures that held their attention despite their worries. But the real breakthrough came when Annie Sullivan approached her desk during the lunch break, holding a folded piece of paper. "What's this, Annie?" Violet opened the paper to find a detailed drawing of the schoolroom, with all 8 children at their desks and herself standing at the blackboard. At the bottom, in careful letters, Annie had written her first words in 2 years. "Thank you." Tears stung Violet's eyes as she knelt beside the silent girl. "Oh, Annie, this is beautiful. And your writing is excellent." Annie smiled, a real smile that transformed her solemn face, and whispered, "I like school." The sound of her voice, soft as spring rain, made the other children gasp with delight. Tommy actually cheered, while Maria clapped her hands in excitement. "Annie talked! Annie talked!" the Fletcher twins chanted, dancing around their desks. The breakthrough felt like a sign, a reminder of why her work mattered regardless of what decisions the adults made. These children needed her, and she needed them. That afternoon, as the students worked on their writing assignments, James appeared in the classroom doorway. He looked tired, as if he'd spent the night wrestling with impossible choices. "Children, please continue your work quietly. I need to speak with Miss Ashford." They stepped into the hallway, and Violet's heart hammered as she waited for him to speak. Would he announce his departure? Ask her to find another position? Thank her for her service and say goodbye? "I've been thinking all night about Sheriff Morrison's news," James began, his voice low and troubled, "about what it means, what choices I have. And, 4 years ago, I ran from Boston because staying meant facing lies and accusations I couldn't disprove. Now I could return with my name cleared, reclaim everything I lost." He paused, studying her face. "But I'd be going back to a life that was never really mine." "What do you mean?" "In Boston, I was James Whitmore III, the heir, the gentleman, the man who lived by other people's expectations. Everything I did was judged by family reputation, social standing, what was proper for someone of my position." He gestured toward the classroom where young voices could be heard discussing their assignments. "Here I became someone else, someone who earned respect through work, not birthright. You could have both now. Return as a successful rancher, a self-made man." "Could I?" His laugh held old pain. "Boston society has a long memory. I'd always be the man who fled scandal, who hid in the wilderness. They take me back because my name was cleared, but I'd never be fully trusted again." Violet understood that fear intimately. She'd lived with the weight of judgment, the way past mistakes could poison future opportunities. "What does your heart tell you to do?" "My heart says I've built something real here. The ranch, the relationships with people like Carlos and Mary, watching children like Annie find their voices." He looked directly at her. "Meeting someone who understands what it means to rebuild your life from nothing." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "James." "Violet, if I stayed in Wyoming, would you consider staying too? Not just as the teacher, but as my partner in this life I've built." The question hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or turn away from. Partnership meant choosing this harsh land, this uncertain future, the man who had shown her that worth came from character rather than circumstances. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you'd want to build something together that's ours, not society's version of what we should be." His voice strengthened with conviction. "I can offer you partnership, respect, affection that's grown from knowing your true character. I can't promise wealth or social status, but I can promise you'll never be judged for your past here." Violet felt tears sting her eyes. The proposal was everything she dreamed of but never dared expect. A partnership based on mutual respect rather than desperation or convenience. "But what about Boston? Your family's fortune? Everything you could reclaim? Money I inherited isn't the same as wealth I created. Status given by birth isn't the same as respect earned through character." James took her hands in his calloused ones. "Caroline chose security over authenticity. I want to choose the opposite." From the classroom came the sound of children's laughter, Annie's voice joining the others for the first time in 2 years. The sound reminded Violet of everything she'd found here: purpose, belonging, the chance to matter in young lives. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes, I want to build that life with you." When James kissed her, it tasted like snow and promises, like the future they'd chosen together over the expectations of a world that had never truly known their hearts. That evening, as they announced their engagement to the ranch family gathered around the dinner table, Violet felt a peace she'd never known. She'd come west as a rejected mail-order bride, worthless in the eyes of a man who'd never met her. She'd found work, purpose, and love with a man who saw her true value. Tomorrow she would write letters, one to the sheriff in Cheyenne, declining to return east, and another to her sister in Philadelphia, explaining her choice to stay in Wyoming Territory as Mrs. James Whitmore. Not because he was wealthy, though his ranch prospered. Not because she needed rescuing, though he'd offered her shelter when she had none. But because together they'd discovered that true worth couldn't be measured in gold or social standing. It could only be found in the daily choice to see and value each other truly, to build something lasting in the vast, unforgiving, beautiful wilderness of the human heart. The wedding dress lay spread across Violet's bed like fallen snow, its simple ivory silk catching the morning light that streamed through her bedroom window. In 3 hours, she would become Mrs. James Whitmore. But first she had to survive the chaos that had erupted downstairs when an unexpected visitor arrived at dawn. "Miss Ashford." Helena's voice carried urgency as her footsteps pounded up the stairs. "You need to come down immediately. There's a woman here claiming to be James's former fiancée." Violet's blood turned to ice. Caroline Pemberton. Here, on her wedding day. She threw a robe over her nightgown and hurried downstairs, her bare feet silent on the wooden steps. In the main parlor, she found a scene that looked like a painting of elegant devastation. Caroline Pemberton stood by the fireplace in a traveling dress of deep blue velvet, her golden hair perfectly arranged despite the long journey from the railroad station. She was everything Violet had imagined and worse: beautiful, poised, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own worth. James stood across the room, his face carved from stone, while the ranch hands gathered in the doorway like witnesses to an execution. The tension in the air was so thick it seemed to crackle. "Caroline." James's voice held no warmth, no surprise, only grim acceptance. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see if the rumors were true. If you really intended to marry some frontier schoolteacher instead of coming home where you belong." Caroline's gaze swept the rustic parlor with obvious disdain. "This is so far beneath you, James. Surely 4 years of exile has been punishment enough." "I'm not being punished. I'm living the life I chose. This," Caroline gestured around the room as if it were a barn. "You could reclaim everything: your family's fortune, your place in Boston society, a proper wife who understands your background." The words hit Violet like physical blows. Proper wife. Someone who understood his background. Everything she wasn't and could never be. "Miss Ashford is more proper than you ever were," James said quietly, his eyes finding Violet's across the room. "She has honor, integrity, genuine kindness. Everything you lack." Caroline's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Oh, how romantic." The millionaire cowboy defending his rescued waif. She turned her attention to Violet for the first time, studying her with the critical eye of someone appraising livestock. "You poor dear. You really believe he loves you, don't you?" "Caroline, that's enough." James stepped forward, his voice carrying warning. "No, let her speak," Violet said, finding her voice despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I'd like to hear what she has to say." Caroline smiled with predatory satisfaction. "He's using you, dear girl. Don't you see? You're his rebellion against everything proper and civilized. When the novelty wears off, when he remembers what real society looks like, he'll discard you just like he's discarding this primitive life." The accusation struck at Violet's deepest fears. Was that all she was? A symbol of James's rejection of his past rather than someone he truly loved? "You're wrong," James said, his voice steady as bedrock. "Violet isn't my rebellion. She's my choice. The best choice I've ever made." "We'll see about that." Caroline moved closer to Violet, her perfume overwhelming in the simple room. Did he tell you about our engagement? How he begged me to marry him? How he promised me everything if I'd just be patient while he proved himself worthy? Each word was designed to wound, to plant seeds of doubt about James's feelings. Violet forced herself to meet Caroline's gaze directly. Did he tell you how I cleared his name? How I confessed to lying about Thomas's death? Caroline's smile turned triumphant. I did that for him, darling, because I realized what I'd lost when I let pride and anger speak for me. The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Caroline hadn't cleared James's name out of guilt or justice. She'd done it to win him back. You recanted your testimony to manipulate him into returning, Violet said, understanding flooding through her. I corrected a mistake that cost us both 4 years of happiness. Caroline turned back to James, her voice softening to the tone she'd probably used during their courtship. I know I hurt you, darling. I know I was foolish and proud. But we could have everything now, your family's shipping business, houses in Boston and Newport, a place in society that matters. I don't want that life anymore. Because you think you want this teacher? Caroline's mask slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. She's a charity case, James. A rejected mail-order bride you rescued from a train platform. When you tire of playing savior, when you remember what it feels like to have real power and influence, you'll thank me for coming. The insults burned, but what frightened Violet more was the flicker of uncertainty she glimpsed in James's eyes. Was Caroline right? Was she simply his act of rebellion against a world that had judged him unfairly? Miss Pemberton, Violet said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. You're absolutely right about one thing. I was rejected and abandoned, left with nothing but my own courage to build a new life. Caroline's smile widened, sensing victory. But you're wrong about everything else, Violet continued. James didn't rescue me from anything. He offered me work, and I earned my place here through my own efforts. The children I teach, the respect I've gained, the life I've built, none of that came from being saved. It came from refusing to let rejection define my worth. She turned to James, her heart hammering but her voice clear. And if you choose to return to Boston with Miss Pemberton, I'll survive that too. Because my value doesn't depend on your choice any more than it depended on William Garrett's acceptance. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. James stared at Violet with something like wonder, while Caroline's perfect composure cracked around the edges. You're making a mistake, James, Caroline said, her voice losing its persuasive warmth. When you realize what you've thrown away for this frontier fantasy, don't come crawling back to Boston expecting forgiveness. I won't, James said simply, because I finally understand the difference between love and possession, between partnership and performance. Caroline's beautiful face contorted with rage and disbelief. You'll regret this. Both of you. She swept from the room with dramatic flair, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the echo of threats. As the sound of her departing carriage faded into the distance, James turned to Violet with eyes that held relief, admiration, and something deeper. You didn't need me to defend you, he said softly. No, I didn't. Just like you didn't need Caroline's approval to know your own worth. Violet smiled, feeling a strength she'd never known she possessed. We're both done letting other people decide who we are. Does this mean you'll still marry me in 2 hours? Try to stop me. But even as James swept her into his arms, Violet couldn't shake the feeling that Caroline's visit was more than a desperate attempt to win back a lost love. There had been something calculated in her timing, something purposeful about her threats. What else was Caroline Pemberton planning? And would their wedding day bring joy or new disasters? The ceremony took place in the ranch house parlor, transformed by wildflowers and candles into something magical despite its simple setting. Violet stood beside James, her hand steady in his as they spoke vows written from their own hearts rather than tradition's demands. I promise to see your worth even when you doubt it yourself, James said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room where their friends had gathered. To build a life with you based on truth, not pretense. I promise to choose you every day, Not from need but from love, Violet replied, her eyes bright with tears of joy. To be your partner in whatever adventures await us. The kiss that sealed their marriage tasted like hope and new beginnings, witnessed by ranch hands who had become family, children who had become her pride and purpose, and Helena who dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. But the celebration was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, not the gentle clip-clop of wedding guests arriving late, but the urgent thunder of horses ridden hard across winter ground. Sheriff Morrison burst into the yard, his face grim with news that would change everything once again. Behind him rode 3 men Violet didn't recognize, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun. James, we need to talk immediately. The sheriff's voice carried across the ranch yard, silencing the wedding celebration like a doused flame. James squeezed Violet's hand once, then stepped outside to meet whatever crisis had arrived. She followed, her wedding dress trailing in the snow, her new husband's strength giving her courage to face the unknown. What's happened? James asked, his voice calm despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. Caroline Pemberton is dead. The words hit like a physical blow. Found her body in her hotel room in Cheyenne this morning. Appears she took poison sometime during the night. The world tilted sideways. Caroline, who had been alive and threatening just hours ago, was gone. Violet felt sick, remembering the hatred in the woman's beautiful eyes as she'd left the ranch. Suicide. James's voice was barely above a whisper. That's what it's supposed to look like. But she left a letter claiming you threatened to kill her if she revealed certain secrets about your business dealings. Sheriff Morrison's expression was apologetic but determined. I'm sorry, James, but I have to take you in for questioning. No. The word escaped Violet's lips before she could stop it. This is our wedding day. Caroline was alive when she left here. Everyone saw her go. I know, Mrs. Whitmore, but the letter she left paints a different picture. Claims James followed her back to town, threatened her in her hotel room. One of the federal marshals stepped forward. We have to investigate every allegation, especially when it involves someone who was already wanted for one suspicious death. James's face had gone pale but resolute. I understand. I'll come willingly. James, no? Violet grabbed his arm, panic rising in her throat. This is obviously Caroline's final revenge. She couldn't have you, so she's trying to destroy your life from beyond the grave. The letter mentions specific details about your past business partnership, things that weren't public knowledge, the marshal continued. We need to determine how she knew those details and whether her death was really suicide. The ranch hands had gathered in a protective circle around James and Violet, their faces hard with anger and loyalty. Carlos stepped forward, his weathered hands clenched into fists. Mr. Whitmore was here all morning, helping prepare for the wedding. None of us left the ranch. I appreciate your loyalty, Carlos, but we have to follow the evidence. Sheriff Morrison looked genuinely sorry. James, you can ride with me voluntarily, or these federal men can arrest you. Your choice. I'll ride with you, Tom. James turned to Violet, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. This is temporary. The truth will come out. What if it doesn't? What if someone else dies mysteriously while you're in custody? Violet's voice broke with fear and fury. How many times will you have to prove your innocence? As many times as it takes. James kissed her forehead softly. I won't run anymore, Violet. We'll face this together, legally and properly. As the lawman prepared to take James away, Helena approached with a bundle wrapped in brown paper. Your wedding clothes, James, for when you come home. The simple gesture broke something inside Violet. Their wedding day, which should have been the happiest of their lives, was ending with her new husband in custody for a crime he didn't commit. How long will you hold him? She asked Sheriff Morrison. Depends on what the investigation turns up. Could be days, could be weeks. His weathered face showed genuine sympathy. Mrs. Whitmore, I've known James for 4 years. He's a good man. We'll get to the bottom of this. But as Violet watched her husband ride away in the custody of federal marshals, his hands bound despite his voluntary surrender, She felt the familiar weight of injustice settling on her shoulders. Caroline Pemberton had found a way to destroy James even in death, to steal their happiness and peace with one final malicious act. The perfect crime, murder disguised as suicide, with a letter designed to frame an innocent man. "What do we do now?" Mary O'Brien asked, her arm around Violet's shoulders as they watched the riders disappear into the distance. "We prove his innocence," Violet said, her voice strengthening with determination. "We find out who really killed Caroline and why they wanted James blamed for it." "How do we do that?" Violet thought of the children she taught, the lessons about research and critical thinking, the importance of examining evidence rather than accepting easy answers. "The same way I teach the children to solve difficult problems. We ask the right questions, gather facts, and refuse to accept conclusions that don't make sense." She turned to face the assembled ranch hands, her wedding dress muddy but her spine straight with purpose. "Caroline didn't come here to win James back. She came here for some other reason. We need to find out what that was." As the sun set over the Wyoming mountains, painting the snow-covered ranch in shades of gold and crimson, Violet stood surrounded by people who had become her family. Her husband was gone, accused of a crime that made no sense, facing a future that could destroy everything they'd built together. But she wasn't the same woman who had sat abandoned on a train platform 3 months ago. That woman had been broken by rejection, defined by other people's judgments, convinced of her own worthlessness. This woman was a teacher, a wife, a fighter who had learned that true worth came from character rather than circumstances. And she would use every ounce of that strength to bring James home and expose the truth behind Caroline Pemberton's death. The real murderer had made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the rejected mail-order bride who had discovered she was worth more than gold. Now they would learn exactly how much that discovery was worth.